So let's get started with the practical demo. I'm just going to switch over to my Ubuntu virtual machine, and we can actually get started with the practical demonstration. So we'll get started with installing and configuring Suricata, and then we'll take it from there. All right, so I'm back on the Ubuntu VM, and again, it isn't running anything on it. So to get started, I would recommend going to the Suricata website, which is at or on suricata.io. If you click on this little this little menu here to your right, this is a collapsible menu. You can click on documentation, and under documentation, you can click on the installation guide. So you can go through the installation manually and compile it from source. And I do recommend taking a look at the Suricata documentation because it really is fantastic. So the great thing with Suricata is you have the binary packages for the latest version, and you'll need to add the repository firstly. So this is the official OISF repository, and it's essentially used for Suricata. So once you add it, you can then update your repositories and then install Suricata directly. So let's do that. So I'm just going to copy that command there, and I'll clear up my terminal, paste that in here, and there we go. So that'll get Suricata, the actual repository, added. So I'll hit enter to continue, and it's then going to add it, and we can then update our repositories and install Suricata. So we'll give this a couple of seconds. There we are. So I'll say sudo apt get update and sudo apt get install Suricata. And I'll use the Y option here just so that it installs directly. So by default, you'll not be prompted to enter the interface. So in that regard, Suricata is much easier to configure and much easier to understand. So this will complete installing Suricata. And there we are. So that's done. Now, one thing to note is that the Suricata can be started and stopped with systemd or the init system that you're using on your distribution. And if you do want to run Suricata on system startup, then you can enable the service. But do note that if you are running this in a virtualized environment and you do not need that functionality, or you don't want Suricata consuming resources and working in the background, then do not enable the service. In my case, I can just do that. So I can say sudo system ctl because I'm running systemd, or this version of Ubuntu comes with systemd. So sudo systemctl enable, and then we can say suricata .service. Don't worry if it gives you this error here. So suricata .service, hit enter, and you can see it's not a native service, so it'll redirect it to systemd sysv install. So it's going to execute it. So that means it's going to be running on startup. So I can then say sudo systemctl status suricata, and it is active and loaded. So we want to stop this. So I'm just going to use the previous command because we don't need it running when we're making configurations. All right, so now that that is done, let's take a look at where all the configuration files and rules are stored. So as I said, it's very similar to Snort in that if I list out the contents of the etc Suricata directory, you can see that you have the Suricata configuration file that's in a YAML, format. Which is great. I really like configuration files that are in YAML. And then you have the rules directory where you have a set of rules that come pre-packaged with Suricata. So for example, if I list out rules here, you can see that we have all of these these various types of rules based on protocols. So we have HTTP, IPsec or IPsec, if you will, NFS, NTP, SMB events, etc. So in order to modify it, you need a root or sudo privileges. So I'm going to say sudo etc in order to modify the configuration file. I'm going to say sudo etc suricata.yaml. Now there's a few things that we need to configure. So this file is quite large and there's tons of configurations you can make. But as you can see, it really is awesome because you can essentially specify or customize the various variables. And it's extremely similar to Snort or the Snort configuration file. So again, the comments to essentially disable a particular option, you can use the hash or the pound symbol. So again, it's fairly simple. So the first thing we need to do is configure the variable. So more specific is better for alert accuracy and performance. So we need to specify our home net subnet address, or the actual network subnet that we would like to monitor. So again, you can get this info by saying ifconfig. So I'll say ifconfig, and my interface here is ENP0S3. That's the interface I want to monitor, and the subnet is 192.168.2.0/24. If I type in IPAS, that'll give you the entire network's your entire network subnet range. In my case, it's 24, right? Okay, so we can specify that here. So again, as it says, make sure it is specific. So I'll just enter insert here, and we only want to enter that network. So 0.0/24. All right, you can also specify the other variable options here to add additional subnets or addresses. And then you can specify, the actual external net variable here. So in this case, we can specify, it's saying not home net, so any address that's not in the home net. So that's perfectly fine. And let me just write the changes. So that's the first option that we need to configure. The next option that I would recommend configuring is the actual AF packet option. So I'll just search for it using / within Vim. If you're using a visual text editor like gedit, that's perfectly fine. Just make sure you open it up, or you open the file with sudo root privileges. So I'll say AF packet. And right, so this is the Linux high-speed capture support. Make sure you specify the correct interface, based on the network you're monitoring. In my case, it's ENP0S3, I believe. Let me just verify that. This is very important. So it's ENP0S3, that is correct. And yeah, so that's set up now. If you do want to add another network interface, you can add that on top here, and you can follow this the actual syntax. Just make sure to change the cluster ID and make it unique, because this is very important. Okay, so that that is done. So this is a cross-platform libpcap capture support. You can also configure that interface if you want to. I recommend doing that. So we can actually set it here. Cross-platform libpcap capture support. We can say ENP0S3. I believe that is the correct syntax. Let's just confirm that. ENP0S3. These interface names on Ubuntu are quite difficult to remember. There we are. So that's done. Okay, so I'll write the changes. The next option we need to set, and this is optional, this is the community flow ID option. This is used for event correlation and is useful when using tools like Zeek, or when you're trying to import the logs in JSON format. So this is very important actually. So we want to search for community ID. So community-ID. So we're looking for this option here. Is this the option? Yes, that's the community flow ID section. So this will add a community ID field to the Eve records. These are meant to give records a predictable flow ID that can be used to match records to the to output of other tools such as Zeek. So it takes a seed that needs to be the same across sensors and tools to make them to make the ID less predictable. So you can enable the community ID feature. By default, Suricata already saves or generates a log file and saves the logs in JSON format. So we can set this to true. And I think that's the only options we need to configure right now. As I said, you can go through the configuration file. It is quite extensive. One other option that I would like to go over is the actual rules. Here. So if I search for this rule path, I believe. Is it the rule path? There we are. Okay, so the rule path, this is the default rule path. It's not under the etc directory. You can change it to be there. But Suricata already has a suricata.rules file that is stored under var lib suricata rules. So if you want to add a custom rules file, then you'd essentially, you can specify it here if it already exists within the directory. So if it's under var lib suricata rules, then you can say, you can just provide the name. So I can say local.rules. However, if it's stored in another directory like etc suricata under rules, and then you can say local.rules, then, you can load it like that. So any custom rule or rule sets that you'd like to load up can be done this way. For now, we don't have that file because Suricata does not create it by default. So I'll just write and quit because we don't want to modify that right now. So let's take a look at the rules stored within var lib and this will require root privileges. So I'll say sudo lsal varlib suricata. Let me make sure I type that in correctly. Varlib, that should be under varlib suricata. It's not displaying, so suricata and then rules. It doesn't look like that exists. That's very interesting, because I think, yeah, I think we need to run suricata one time in order for that to be reflected, or in order for that to be created. So because we haven't updated the suricata rule sets, we need to do that next. Now, this can easily be done by typing in sudo suricata and then suricata update. So suricata doesn't have a man page or man pages, as you can see here. So you can open up the help menu by saying suricata help, right? And the options, as you can see, are fairly simple. So you can specify the configuration file, whether you want to test the configuration file. And then, of course, you have the suricata update option, which is what we're going to do now. So we'll say sudo suricata update. So let's hit enter. That's going to, as you can see, it's going to use the following directory. So using the configuration etc suricata suricata.yaml. By the way, you can create another configuration file, but I don't recommend doing that. So you can see it's going to load the distribution rule file from etc suricata rules smt. So, you know, from that directory there. So it's then, once that is done, it is then going to perform the suricata configuration test to make sure that there's nothing wrong in terms of the options and syntax that you've used within the suricata configuration file. So we'll give this a couple of seconds. It doesn't take too long. All right, so that is done. So now if we try and list that directory, you can see it exists. So you have suricata.rules. And, you know, that contains an aggregation of all the rules. So if you take a look at what was displayed here, you can see that no sources have been configured. I'll explain that in a second. So it's going to fetch the latest rules from emergingthreads.net. So these are suricata rules. These are emerging rules. So that's great. It's then going to load the distribution file there. And it's going to ignore that file there. So that is done. Enabled 131 rules for flow bit dependencies, creating the directory, backing up the current rules, and it's then going to write the rules to suricata.rules. So it's going to add all the rules from these rule files here, or these rule sets, into suricata.rules, which is, you know, really, really cool. Now, one of the really cool features that Suricata offers is the ability to specify your own sources. So by default, Suricata allows you to select other sources that you'd like to essentially retrieve rules from or rule sets from. You can obtain this by saying sudo suricata update. So sudo suricata update, and you can then say list sources and hit enter. So it's going to download the index of sources. So these are all the sources that will give you various types of you know, rule sets based on your own requirements. So the one that we were using was I believe, let's see, where was this one from? Let's see if it was actually added or it's using the default one. Yeah, so the default one is not here because it's already added. So these are the other ones available. So we have one from ET Open, that's from Proofpoint, and then we have, and of course, some of these will require a subscription. So you can see the license is commercial in this case. If it is MIT or open source, then you can essentially pull them without any issues or without having a or registering for a subscription. So if we take a look at some ones that we can use, like this one here, or maybe this this Win malware rule set here, in order to add it or enable that source, we can say sudo suricata update list sources, or in this case, we're saying enable source, and then we specify the name of the source. So, you know, we can just copy that there like so and paste that in there and hit enter. And you can see that that is done. So now we can update. We can say sudo suricata update just to make sure that we get the latest here. All right, fantastic. So that is done. It's now going to test the configuration. And we'll give this a couple of seconds. Once that is done, we can actually test it ourselves, and I'll show you how to do that. The syntax is very, very simple. All right, so that is done. If we take a look at Suricata, the actual Suricata service, so sudo systemctl status Suricata, it should be disabled. There we are. So it's currently disabled, which is good. So in order for us to test the configuration file, we can say sudo suricata. We use the T option to test it. And just like snort, we can specify the configuration file. So I can say sudo suricata t c. That's the configuration file. So suricata and suricata.yaml. And we can use the verbose output option there. So it's running it in test mode. And it's going to give you an overview of your resources and the actual fast output device, or the logging configuration is in fast mode, similar to what we did with snort. And it also has the Eve log output device, which outputs it in JSON. So you can see this is the name of this file here is called fast.log. So that's where you can find all the intrusion logs. You then have eve.json, which contains the same information just in JSON format. And you can see that one rule file was processed, 25,504 rules successfully loaded, and 0 rules failed. Okay, so that is done. We know that Suricata will run without any issues, right? So in order to start it, we can essentially just say sudo systemctl. We don't need to run it from the command line, or you can, but you can run it in. You can actually run it in the daemon mode, or run the Suricata daemon, similar to what we had with Splunk, which I didn't cover. Sorry, not with Splunk, with snort, which I did not cover. We had the daemon option, which will run it in the background. So there we are, run as daemon. So you can also do that with snort. That is something that I completely went over, but yeah, you can actually see that you can specify your own signature rules there and the actual configuration file. But to run it with systemd, you can simply say sudo systemctl start suricata .service. All right, so we can then check the status just to make sure everything is running as it should be. Should say active and loaded. Fantastic. So now that that is done, what that means is that it's actually running in the background. So that means it's actually monitoring the network traffic and is logging all files to the following directory. So var log and suricata. So you can see we have the fast.log file, which contains the actual intrusion logs stored in the standard output format, and then eve.json, which saves it in JSON format. So to run a quick test, we can utilize one of the Suricata rules that is included within the rules file, the default one, which is stored under the directory that we just saw. So it's going to be stored under this file. So if I list out the contents of this directory, that rule is part of this rules file. And that rule essentially just detects, whether we're querying. You'll actually see the actual event. It's much better if I do it that way. So to essentially test this out, we can say the following. So I can say curl http test my NIDS, which is used to test your network intrusion detection system. So test my NIDS.org. And we're just testing whether it's going to monitor or track all of this. And I know I'm running this from the actual server here. So I can say test my nids.org, uid index.html. Let me just type that in correctly, HTML, hit enter. There we are. So it just tells us uid root. So that information is considered to be is actually considered to be malicious, because it means that we have gained access to root, or an intruder could have gained access to root. So how do we know whether this was logged? Well, to do that, we can say sudo cat var log, and we can go under suricata and fast.log, and you can see that that was actually logged there. And it's, as I said, it's running in the background, which is absolutely fantastic. So as you can see here, we have the actual log here. So it tells us where it was coming from, where it was going to, etc. Right? So this is good that it's working. We know that it is indeed working. So let's talk about custom rules. All right. So in order to do that, I'm just going to stop the Suricata service because we don't need it running right now. So I'm going to say stop. And let's take a look at how to write custom rules. So I'm going to store the rules. We can store it. You can store them wherever you want. Just make sure to update that in the actual suricata.yaml config file. So I'll say sudo vim etc. We can store it here or under the var lib directory under suricata and rules. So I can say etc suricata rules, and I'll say local.rules. So I'm creating the rules file here. And just like we did with Snort, the actual syntax is exactly the same. So we say alert, the type is of alert, and then we can say ICMP. In this case, this is going to track or log any pings that are coming from any external network into our home network. So we specify the home net variable. So that means the subnet that we specified. And we can then specify the message that we want displayed in the log. So we can say ICMP ping. And let's see, I believe that is the correct syntax. And then, yeah, we can just close that up there. And we can then specify the SID, which in this case, we'll just keep it to 1 because this is a custom one anyway. Revision 1 as well. And we can then close those brackets there. Okay, so I think that looks good. We didn't specify the port here, which is why the syntax highlighting was not reflected. So any port coming into our home network. So write in quit, and then we can modify the YAML configuration file. So let me just head over to that command there. I should have actually typed it in, but there we are. So we are looking for a rule path, and we want to add it here. These are the other rules or rule sets that we would like to add. So I'll say this is under etc suricata rules local.rules. Let me type that in correctly. So local.rules, and we can write in quit. You can then test the configuration just to make sure there isn't any issue with it. So I'll hit enter. And if all is good, then we know that we can run Suricata without any issues. And then we can test whether, that ping is actually processed or, detected by our intrusion detection system. So we'll just give this a couple of seconds. All right, so now that is done, we can say sudo systemctl start suricata.service. Okay, that is done. I'm just going to run a ping from the Kali Linux system, so I don't need to show you that. I'll just run a ping on this device, or I can run it on maybe the router, on my router here. So I'm just running the ping now, and I'll let it run for a couple of seconds, and we'll check the log to see whether that is actually detected. All right, so I've performed the ping, and we can take a look at the log file now. So let's take a look at the fast.log file. In this case, it doesn't look like, is that actually started? Is the Suricata service started? So I'm going to say status. There we are. And if I type in ifconfig, that is correct. So sudo systemctl status var, that actually should be logged. I'm just going to run the ping again. All right, so after a couple of seconds, I just ran the ping on the actual Ubuntu server, primarily because I know that I'd blocked pings on my router, which makes a lot of sense now. But you can actually see that based on our custom rule ICMP ping there, you can see that, we didn't set the priority, but we could have, just as we did with Snort. So it's ICMP, where it came from. So it came from this system here, and it came onto the Ubuntu server. So those have been logged, and, we can essentially keep up to date with the latest logs. Now, I also wanted to showcase the actual JSON or the eve.json log file, which, again, if you actually cat out the content with cat, it's not going to be readable because it's in JSON format. So one tool that we can use is the JSON command line processing tool, also known as JQ. So we can say sudo apt get install JQ. It's a very small package, and it will essentially allow us to view this in a way that makes sense. So we can utilize the tail utility to display the latest logs or alerts, if you will. So the file is var log and Suricata eve.json, and we can then pipe that into the JQ utility and say that we want to select, and within brackets we can say .event. So that event type is going to be equal to an alert. So we'll put this in double quotes. The syntax is fairly simple, and we then need to close the brackets and single quote there, hit enter. And because this is using tail, then we would need to perform or simulate another type of intrusion. In this case, we can just perform a ping, and I know that should be displayed because Suricata is running in the background. So let me just perform the ping here, and because we're using tail, it's going to display the latest logs. So we'll give this a couple of seconds. All right, so after a couple of seconds, I just performed the ping on another device on my network. You can see that this is really helpful when you have this data displayed in JSON format, because you essentially get information like the timestamp, the source IP, the source port, the destination IP, the destination port, the protocol is ICMP, and then of course we have the signature, which is ICMP ping. Action is allowed. If you were running it in IPS mode, then we could say, drop or reject, etc. But yeah, this is very useful. As I said, this can be very useful when you're importing it into tools like Zeek, or when you're performing event correlation. So yeah, we can just terminate that command there. I just want to take a couple of moments to thank our Patreons. Thank you, Michael Hubbard, Dustin Umpress, Jerry Speds, Doozy, Sid Saab, Ryan Carr, Shamir Douglas, Jojo Bibi, Palangos, Kushkev, RS, Nino Buikov, and David Bricker. You guys are really awesome. Thank you very much for supporting us, and you guys make these types of videos possible. So we really appreciate it, and we look forward to producing even more high quality content.